Sergeant Major Elroy Simmons, retired. United States Army, 26 years of service, 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. A combat medical badge and a chest full of commendations that he had left at home in his closet because he had not wanted to make the flight from Dallas to Atlanta about anything other than getting to his granddaughter's 5th birthday party on time, was told by a flight attendant named Tracy Wills on American Airlines Flight 247 in the boarding zone of Gate C11 at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport to get in the correct line when he moved to board in the priority lane he had been assigned. He showed her his boarding pass. She said, "That lane is for our priority customers." He said, "I am a priority customer. I'm in 3B. She said, "Sir, could I see some additional ID?" He showed her his military ID. She said, "That's not what I." The man behind Sergeant Simmons in the boarding line, a white man in a business suit, boarding pass in hand, who had not been asked for any additional ID, said, loudly enough for the next 12 people in line to hear, "Ma'am, I've been watching this for 3 minutes. This man showed you his boarding pass twice. He's getting on this plane." Tracy Wills said, "Sir, I'm going to need you to." The man said, "He's getting on this plane." 11 people behind him said nothing. 6 people behind him said, "He's getting on this plane." Elroy Simmons boarded the plane. He sat in 3B. He was handed a drink by a different flight attendant who had heard everything through the jetway and who, when she handed him the drink, said, "Thank you for your service, sir. I'm sorry about what happened at the gate." When Steve Harvey heard the full story on the Family Feud stage 12 months later, including what the man in the suit had done after landing, he took off his glasses and held them in his hand for 14 seconds and said nothing at all. And the story he told when he finally spoke would be seen by 334 million people and change the pre-boarding ID policy for military personnel at every major American carrier. It was a Monday afternoon in April, 12 months after the flight, when the Simmons family walked onto the Family Feud stage in Atlanta. Elroy, 61, had the bearing of a man who had spent 26 years making himself steady in unsteady places and had not unlearned it in retirement. His wife Gloria was beside him, 58, a retired school librarian with the particular watchful love of a woman who has sent a man to war twice and received him back both times, and is still, in some part of herself, counting her blessings every morning. Their son Marcus, their daughter-in-law Denise, and Elroy's best friend of 40 years, Sergeant First Class Bernard Washington, rounded out the team. Bernard had driven from Houston without being asked, because that was who Bernard was. Steve came out and landed immediately on Elroy and Bernard. He said, "Gentlemen, did you serve together?" Elroy said, "Baghdad 2003, Bernard said. "He carried me out of a building." Steve looked at them. He said, "I'm going to need that story." Elroy said, "There are better ones." Steve said, "Then give me all of them." Elroy had the easy authority of someone who had been the person others looked to for a long time and had become comfortable with it without becoming proud of it. He smiled at Steve's jokes and did not perform modesty about his service. He had been asked about it enough times to know how to answer without diminishing it or overstating it. He said what it was and what it required and what it had cost, and then he said other things. He was not his service. He was also a man who liked to garden and had a standing Saturday call with his 3 grandchildren and cooked the best brisket in Tarrant County by any objective measure, which Bernard would confirm under oath. Nobody in that studio knew about the man in the suit yet. Nobody knew what he had done after landing. But that wasn't even the part that would make Steve Harvey hold his glasses in his hand for 14 seconds. The flight had been a Tuesday morning in April. Elroy had been traveling to Atlanta for his granddaughter Layla's 5th birthday. A direct flight. Booked 6 weeks ahead. Seat 3B. First class, which he had purchased with points he had accumulated over 30 years of flying. He was dressed in civilian clothes, a button-down, slacks, good shoes. He had not worn his uniform because he did not consider it a uniform occasion. He had his military ID in his wallet because he carried it everywhere, the way you carry things that define a context you have lived in for 26 years. He had his boarding pass on his phone. He had arrived at Gate C11 at 9:47 for a 10:15 flight. He had moved to the priority lane because that was his lane. Tracy Wills had been the first face he encountered. He had shown her his phone. She had looked at it and said the things she said. He had shown her his military ID, not because it should have been necessary, not because his boarding pass wasn't sufficient, but because he was 61 and retired and had no interest in a conflict at an airport gate. She had said what she said about additional ID. He had looked at her for a moment. He had understood what was happening. He had been understanding what was happening in rooms like this one, with faces like this one, for 61 years. He had understood it with the particular, comprehensive weariness of a man who has served his country for 26 years and still cannot board an airplane in the lane he paid for, without being asked to prove himself twice. The man in the suit's name, Elroy later learned from an airport official who had reviewed the gate footage, was David Park. He was 34 years old, a technology consultant from Chicago, and had been standing 3 places behind Elroy in the priority lane. He had watched the first boarding pass check without comment. He had watched the request for additional ID without comment. He had watched the military ID presented and not accepted with a comment he could no longer suppress. He had said what he said. He had said it again when Tracy Wills tried to redirect him. He had said, "He's getting on this plane." He had said it with the calm, flat finality of a man who has made a decision and is not going to unmake it. 11 people said nothing. 6 people said it with him. On the plane, David Park had sat in 4A, directly behind Elroy. During the flight, he had leaned forward and introduced himself. He had said, "I'm David. I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner." Elroy had said, "You said it." David had said, "I should have said it at the first check." Elroy had said, "But you said it." David had said, "I want to give you my card. If you decide to file a complaint, and you should file a complaint, I'll be a witness." Elroy had taken the card. He had looked at it. He had said, "What made you say something?" David had said, "Because you showed your boarding pass twice, and she asked for something else. And I know what that means. I have a sister who flies for work. I've been on the phone with her when it's happened to her." He had said, "I should have been louder sooner." Elroy had said, "You were loud enough." They had talked for the rest of the flight. By the time they landed, Elroy knew David's name and the name of his sister and the city he grew up in, and the fact that he had never served but had a great uncle who had. Elroy had given him his card in return. He had said, "Come to Dallas sometime. I make the best brisket in Tarrant County." David had said, "I'll take that." Elroy had filed the complaint with American Airlines that evening. He had called David Park the following day to tell him. David had said, "Good. I filed one too." He had. He had filed a detailed witness complaint from Chicago, 12 hours after landing, that described the entire gate interaction in specific and sequential terms. American Airlines reviewed both complaints. Tracy Wills was placed on administrative review. The airline's pre-boarding ID policy for military personnel was flagged for review. Elroy told Gloria that evening. She had been at the birthday party when he arrived. He had come in, hugged Layla, eaten 2 pieces of cake, said nothing about the airport. When the party was over and they were in the guest room that night, he told her. She had listened. She had said, Elroy. He had said, I'm fine. She had said, I know. But I'm not. He had said, Gloria. She had said 26 years, 2 tours, and she asked for additional ID. He had said, David said something. She had said, I know. You told me. She had said, is he a good man? Elroy had said, he's a man who said the right thing. She had said, that's the same thing. She had said, are you going to call him? He had said, I already have. He told his granddaughter Layla nothing about the airport. Layla was 5 and had just had a birthday party and had eaten an amount of cake that Elroy declined to calculate, and had received a purple bicycle from her parents, which she had christened Thunder, and had attempted to ride in the living room before being redirected to the driveway. She had said, the following morning, when she found Elroy at the kitchen table, Grandpa, are you sad? He had said, no, baby, I'm thinking. She had said, Nurse lady, are you mad at me? She had recently seen an episode of a medical show and was applying the phrase nurse lady to all adults in a caregiving position, which in her taxonomy included grandfathers. Elroy had looked at her for a moment. He had said, I'm not mad at anything, Layla. I'm proud of you. She had said, for the bicycle? He had said, for everything. She had said, okay. She had gone to find Thunder. Steve Harvey would later say that David Park was the most important person who had never appeared on his show. The game was deep in round 1 when Steve said, Elroy, you and Bernard both flew to be here today. Any travel stories? The studio laughed. Elroy smiled. Then he told the story. Not in the flat legal voice he had used for the airline complaint, in the quiet, direct voice of a man telling the truth to someone who will understand it. He said the boarding pass, the lane, the ID, the military ID, the second request. David Park behind him in line. He said, 6 people said he's getting on this plane. He said, one of them was a stranger. He stopped. He said, I had a chest full of commendations at home in my closet. I had 2 tours. I had 26 years. And at Gate C11 I was a man who needed someone to say out loud what was true. He stopped. He said, David said it. The room held its breath. 300 people did not move. Steve Harvey took off his glasses. He held them in his hand. He stood that way for 14 seconds. When he spoke, his voice was level and complete. He said, stop the game. No network. No approval. This room. He held up his hand. He said, this has never happened. A veteran standing at my podium telling me he needed someone to say out loud what was true after 26 years of service. This has never happened. He paused. He said, I promised God, when I had nothing, when I was sleeping in that car, when no room would let me in without someone questioning my right to be there. I promised that when I got out of that car, I would be David Park in every room I entered. I would say the true thing. He said, David Park said the true thing at Gate C11. And I want his name on this stage. He looked at Elroy directly. He said, serve first. Always serve first. That is who you were and who you are. And no boarding pass check changes that. He wasn't done. He pulled out his phone and called a university, specifically the American University School of Law's Aviation Law Clinic, which he knew had been working on military passenger rights cases. He asked the clinic director to take Elroy Simmons's case as a named civil rights complaint against American Airlines, fully supported by the Harvey Foundation, and to use the case as the basis for a proposed federal pre-boarding policy guaranteeing that military ID alone constitutes sufficient verification for any boarding lane. He ended the call. He announced both families, the Simmonses and the competing family, The Washingtons from Atlanta were walking out with the full $20,000. The Washington family crossed the stage. Their father, who had served in the Navy for 18 years, shook Elroy's hand with both of his, then turned to Bernard and shook his hand too. Bernard said, "Baghdad, 2003. The man said, "Gulf, 1991. They stood there for a moment. No one said anything. Hardened television professionals were looking at the floor. The episode aired 9 weeks later. 334 million views. The hashtag #HesGetting on this plane trended in 29 countries for 13 days. David Park, who had been contacted by the Family Feud producers before the taping and had declined to appear on camera, "This isn't about me, please don't include me," was mentioned by name in the episode. He released a brief statement after it aired. "I did the minimum." Sergeant Major Simmons served for 26 years. The story is his. "I just said what was true." His statement was shared 4.1 million times. 3 months after the taping, American Airlines revised its pre-boarding policy to explicitly state that military ID, veterans ID, or a boarding pass marked with military status constitutes full and complete verification for any boarding lane or seat upgrade process. The policy change was adopted by Delta, United, and Southwest within 90 days. The revision became known internally at American Airlines as the Simmons policy. A year after the taping, David Park flew to Dallas. He brought his sister. Elroy made brisket. Gloria made 3 side dishes. Bernard drove over from Houston. They had dinner at the Simmons kitchen table. 5 people who had connected through a boarding lane in April gathered around food in November, talking about things that had nothing to do with the airport and everything to do with what the airport had revealed. When David's sister flew home the following morning, she posted a photograph of the dinner table. No faces, just the table, the food, the plates, with the caption, "This is what it looks like when someone says the true thing." It was shared 2.2 million times. Steve Harvey shared it. He added 2 words: "Serve first." Today, the Uniform and Dignity Fund, named for the commendations Elroy left at home because he hadn't wanted to make the flight about anything other than getting to the birthday party, provides legal advocacy and policy reform support for military veterans and active duty personnel facing discriminatory treatment in commercial travel settings. Its motto, taken from what Elroy told Steve backstage when Steve asked what he most wanted people to understand about his service, is, "I served so the room would be big enough for everyone." Make it big enough. The fund has filed 34 formal airline discrimination complaints, contributed to 8 policy revisions across 5 carriers, and partnered with the Department of Veterans Affairs to produce a traveler's rights guide distributed to 880,000 veterans nationwide. Steve spoke about Elroy in an interview the following spring. He said, "He had a chest full of commendations at home in his closet. He left them there because he wasn't trying to make the flight into anything. He just wanted to get to his granddaughter's birthday party. And a woman at gate C11 decided he needed to prove himself twice. And 6 people said no." That's the whole story. 6 people, 1 man, a birthday party, and 26 years of service that deserved better than a gate. 2 years after the taping, Layla turned 7. She had outgrown Thunder, but had named the new bicycle Thunder the 2, which Elroy felt showed excellent continuity. He was there for the party. He flew first class. He boarded in the priority lane. Nobody asked for anything beyond his boarding pass. If Elroy's 26 years and David's 6 words moved you, subscribe and hit that thumbs up. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that saying the true thing out loud is the minimum, and that the minimum can change everything. Have you ever watched someone be questioned for something they'd already proven? Let us know in the comments. And ring that notification bell for more moments that restore our faith in what it means to stand in someone's corner.